All right, welcome to the RSP cast. We are continuing our 2020 projection series. Dwain McFarland, welcome back. We're going to have a fun show today because it's basically, I don't know, it's the team that was as versus the team that is, I guess, the Cleveland Browns and the Baltimore Ravens. We're going to profile half of the NFC North. Should be a great show.
Yeah, absolutely. These are two teams that I'm very, very excited, about discussing. I think, obviously, in one case we've got a coaching change, right? Kevin Stefanski coming in for Cleveland. The other team, we've got an offense that really took the league by storm. Doing some things that other teams just weren't ready for or not staffed to appropriately handle. So yeah, I think this is probably the show that I'm the most excited about so far. This preseason.
Well, heck, they're two of my three favorite or two of my four favorite teams in the league. So, and by far probably my two favorites. So this is absolutely a fun one for me too. Let's start off with the Baltimore Ravens. Certainly, they're one of the hottest teams in the league, and you have that record season with Lamar Jackson in terms of a personal best for him. And the fact that he was able to not only be a terrific runner, but more importantly, he was such an efficient passer. And we really got to see what was kind of the promise that he showed at Louisville come to life and come to fruition in terms of what he did in the pocket, how he was in terms of tight windows in the middle of the field. He pretty much played the way we talked about him last year, which was he's very good in the middle of the field. He's very good under pressure, but outside the numbers, that's where his accuracy dwindles. And they pretty much, crafted the offense so he didn't have to do a ton of that. So, his ability to run, his threat as a play action passer and a pocket passer really opened things up for the run game in terms of Mark Ingram, who had a career year with 15 total touchdowns. Now Ingram is at a crossroads because he has a couple more years, or maybe a year left on his
A year
deal.
left.
Yeah, a year left, and they drafted who I thought was the best rookie back in the draft class. 1-2 with Jonathan Taylor, and that's J.K. Dobbins. And the Ravens felt like they got the best back in the class too, because he reminded them of the same guy he reminded me, which is Ray Rice. So you get a Ray Rice type of back in J.K. Dobbins with more speed. And that's going to be an interesting development in terms of how Ingram and Dobbins work together. And then you look at this receiving core, and it's like Marquise Brown showed so much to begin the year, but he did it coming off of a foot injury that really wasn't, he wasn't fully ready. He wasn't even at the weight he wanted to be at. He played at like 168 pounds, and he wants to play in that 180 range. So he was underweight. He was still not probably in optimum shape, and definitely not in optimum physical condition with his foot. And he still lit things up at times, as a rookie. Then you had, Miles Boykin, a personal favorite of mine, who played really well in the preseason, but two things didn't factor well for him. One is that he was kind of the opposite of Lamar Jackson. Like they didn't complement each other at all, because where Miles Boykin was excellent, which was on the perimeter, running those timing routes, where Jackson isn't great at being able to target him. He struggled in terms of knowing when to look and anticipate his quarterback in the middle of the field, where he had some issues. If you talk to guys like the Russell Street Report, who are a nice outfit in Baltimore, who do analysis of their team, they talked in their film study about Boykin just having issues being able to anticipate when to settle down in a zone, where to attack the football, where to keep his eyes in terms of, working with Jackson on scramble drills and being ready at all times. And so that was kind of an issue. And then you have guys like Willie Snead, who's still a nice veteran, but they added James Prochet, who seems to be a Willie Snead like player. They added Devin Duvernay, who seems to me to be like a combination of Marquise Brown and Danny Woodhead, who could be a really intriguing player for them. And so you wonder if Boykin's going to have a shot to really develop in there. So that's an intriguing wide receiver core that ties into the development we need to talk about with Jackson, if there's going to be any additional development. And of course, probably the best receiving the best receivers in the core, or the most targeted at least, are going to be the tight ends, and they lost, Hayden Hurst to Atlanta, which is going to be an interesting discussion when we get to that someday. But Mark Andrews, certainly made good as one of the top move tight ends in terms of production. And they still have the sturdy Nick Boyle, who's not going to do much for you fantasy wise, but he might give you a little bit more because Jake Breeland to me is like Nick Boyle light probably. So it looks like if they're only going to they may go with two tight ends in this unit, but only one of them is going to be getting a ton of catches, if you ask me. Which means, again, the receiving core and the running backs seem to have a little bit more on them this year, maybe in terms of a development. So, that's kind of my overview of where the Ravens were, what the questions are ahead. What are your thoughts statistically about the scheme from last year and in terms of how you're setting them up to project them this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on a lot of the great stuff around the personnel and some of the things that they're doing. Even last year during the season, some of the moves they made. I mean, if you look at their secondary, wow. How would you? I mean, where's the weakness, Matt? I mean, Marlon Humphreys. You got Marcus Peters now. That you bring over from the Rams. You've got in the secondary, you've got Earl Thomas and as your backstop, essentially. And then you still have Jimmy Smith. They're getting back. Gosh, now I'm forgetting his name, but they have a slot corner that they love that they're getting back this year that was hurt. So it's Young. Yeah, I mean, if this team gets you in a bind with what they can do from a time of possession and how much they can shut down any kind of comeback with their secondary, it's just, I mean, they're really built well. I mean, I think it's a team that they've done a lot of things right. As far as their scheme goes, last year, this is crazy. They passed the ball 42% of the time and they ran the ball 58%.
Yes.
Like that, yeah. That says AFC North like nothing else, right, Matt?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, and really, Greg Roman, we talked about this last year. Really, he had taken over as the play caller towards the end of 2018. Basically, once Lamar Jackson went in, it really wasn't Marty Morningwig's offense anymore. The whole thing had changed, and we talked about this last year. And a lot of that really, just it came through. But they were able to, I think last year I had them projected at 50% pass and 50% run, or maybe slightly over 51-49, which is very aggressive. I mean, 42-58 is insane. But if we think about it, it really resembled, Greg Roman's 49er teams, of 2011 through 2014. It was run heavy. They had a running quarterback in Colin Kaepernick, who's, not as good as what Lamar Jackson is, but they did a lot of the same thing. Even back then, they were running the ball more than they were throwing the ball. And so it's not like this is a new trend for Greg Roman. It's also not necessarily a really new trend, for John Harbaugh. He likes to have that balance. For a few years they went away from it, because they had invested in Joe Flacco and they got really pass happy. That didn't work well. And so I think they're back to a spot where Harbaugh's comfortable, even in neutral, in scripts where, you're basically tied, it was 44% pass and 55% and 56% run. So, I mean, this is what they want to do. So that's excluding, basically you got to be within 3 points, and that excludes 2-minute warnings. So that's basically how I come up with a neutral script. So 44, 56, pass to run. They led for 61% of their plays. That's insane. Their average margin of victory was 15.6. I mean, they were literally destroying everyone. So I think the question, this year, we know Roman historically runs the ball more than almost all coordinators, leading, tied, or trailing. He doesn't care what the game script is. But I think the question, Matt, is how much can other teams figure out, or can they retool? Because the league does eventually catch up on these things. And the Ravens offense really put people in a huge bind last year. And I think it will still be problematic this year, but can teams close the gap on that some? And I think they've made investments elsewhere, like, the secondary, so that as that may happen, they're still equipped, right, to be a really competitive team. So, as far as the passing game goes, obviously it's an efficient passing game. When you're passing that little, it's going to be really about, what you're doing on a yards per attempt basis. And again, there's another thing with Roman that's not new. 4 out of 7 years as a play caller, his teams have eclipsed 7.5 yards per attempt, which is really good. His offenses have topped 5% touchdowns per attempt in 3 of 7 seasons where he's calling plays. He's typically more of a yards in the air than a yards after catch guy. He's always 57% plus, so he's putting air under the ball. It's not not a ton of dink and dunk. They do some nice scheme things, and they'll do some things for Marquise Brown, et cetera. But it's really more about, getting air under the ball. They don't really target the running backs in the passing game much. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Part of that is, you have a quarterback that takes off, and sees a better alley to, yardage versus dumping it down to the running back. If you look at the running backs overall, it's really poorly, I wouldn't want to say poorly, just not used very much. But the other thing going on is typically if you use your tight ends a ton, that's a trade-off versus your runners. A lot of teams that use their tight ends a lot don't use their runners as much, and vice versa. If you're a heavy passing to the running back, especially if you've got running backs that get downfield, a little bit more. And that's not always the case, but it's definitely a trend that you see. Last year though, Matt, 8.4%, is their touchdowns per attempt. That's insane. Like you said, they love the tight ends, ran 11 personnel 47% of the time, 12, 18% of the time, 22, 15% of the time, 21, 10% of the time. So basically, if you look at their 12, their 22, and their 21. So for people that, maybe this is new, the 12 is 2 tight ends on the field with 2 receivers. 22 is 2 running backs and 2 tight ends. 15% in that set. You don't see that. That's not a set that you see very often in the league, and they ran it 15% of the time.
They went back to the 70s and 80s there.
They did, man. It's just, but they had great personnel to do it with, and again, it was working, and they were playing from ahead, and definitely helps. So it will be interesting to see, does that change a little bit with Hayden Hurst, being gone, because really, if you look at what they've done, they added, like you said, they added Duvernay. Last year, they added Boykins and they added Hollywood. So, and they've got some other receivers already on the team. They could go a little more 11 personnel this year than what they did last year. I think that's going to be something, interesting to see. So, that's the basic overview. They destroyed everyone. So I'm really interested to see how much can other teams catch up. I think they're still going to be a run-heavy team no matter what. I don't think other teams can catch up enough based on how their roster is constructed. But at the same time, they could be pushed to be a little more balanced, right? Like maybe more of a 48-52, something like that. So, which is where I've got them, Matt. Vegas has them at 11.5 wins on the season, which is tied with Kansas City for tops in the league. So Vegas obviously thinks very highly of them. They won 14 games last year. If you look at a team that's going to be winning and we know what they like to do, they're still probably going to run more than they're going to pass. It'll just be interesting to see how much.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most salient point that we can make, is that how our defense is going to adjust and what does that look like? Because from a field perspective, not even just looking at the numbers, but how the field matches the numbers that you just provided. When you watch Lamar Jackson keep the football and run, for the past 2 years, I keep hearing everyone, especially commentators and media, say he can't take too much punishment. He's got to learn how not to take punishment. And I'm sitting here watching the games and I'm going, when does he get hit? Because when
he's really smart.
Yeah, because when I watch these option plays and where he keeps it, he has, like, not only because of his speed, but because of how well it's blocked and the design of the play, he's running for like 7 to 15 yards untouched and exits the boundary, and occasionally he gets shoved out of bounds. Occasionally he'll take a hit, but it's not like Cam Newton fullbacking his way through NFL defenses. He's like, I have never seen a quarterback gain so many yards and not get touched or basically get feather dusted, at the end of plays. And so,
yeah, he's throwing in the spin move, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's rarely him running inside or in the middle of the field. When he does, it's like a huge play. And he's usually he usually gets a massive gain and he's dragged down from behind. But when they run outside, which I think is the most frequent things that he does, is outside the tackle box, he's barely touched on any of those plays. He's getting like easy chunk gains. And it's like, until defenses can stop that, and that's going to be the key. Like and I think that's what defenses will be attacking first. They're going to be like, we got to stop those easy games in the middle of the field, which is easier said than done because then they just ram Mark Ingram or J.K. Dobbins up the middle behind those awesome, interior linemen that they had. Now Marshall Yanda's gone, which is going to be a big impact to that team. The fact that he retired, but still, guard is reasonably decent enough to replace in terms of the run game. That's usually the strength of pretty much every guard who blocks. So, Yonda will be missed, but I have a feeling that, he'll be missed more on some of those outside plays where he can get out upfield and outside a little bit better than maybe some of the other guys can that will try to replace him. But that said, it's going to be hard for defenses to stop that outside play without giving up what happens on the inside. If they're successful with that, then I think you are going to see more 11 personnel. And it seems like the way you stated it very well, they're preparing to have to do that. Like they're trying to say, all right, let's play some chess here. While we're not going to play checkers with our offense here. Let's play a little chess and think ahead. And so there's that in mind. I have this team starting off, with Lamar Jackson. I have the offense passing 43.5% of the time, which is up a percent and a half from last year. So maybe it'll go up more because of what I just stated, but because it was so easy for Jackson last year, I'm kind of waiting for defenses to prove that they can stop this, because it's not like Jackson is bad in the pocket. So usually you have quarterbacks who have certain kinds of deficiencies with reading the field in a way that Jackson hasn't shown when they're able to run outside. So, Jackson may not be a complete quarterback in terms of what he can do outside the numbers, but when it comes to playing in the pocket, he's one of the best quarterbacks in the league. So, I have Jackson right now, not much different than last year. I have him at 421 attempts, 271 completions for a 64.4% rate. I have him completing 7.59 yards per attempt, 31.94 in terms of yardage, 32 touchdowns at 7.6%. Still a massive number there. 9 interceptions, 0.21%, which is still pretty darn low. Pretty much like last year, because I think that's what he had last year. So did Josh Allen, who only threw for 3,000 yards and 58%, by the way. And then rushing attempts of 155 for 980 and 7 touchdowns. I haven't changed much from last year in terms of what he did. I think I lowered the touchdown value a little bit, and that's probably the biggest change for him for last year. What about you? Where do you see Lamar Jackson?
Yeah, real quick on the team, I've got them at 48% pass and 52% run. So I still have them heavier pass than run. I'm just baking in, them coming back to the norm just a little bit.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you look historically at the league over the last 15 years, that's still very aggressive, as far as,
the ball.
Yeah, because I mean, random things that we can't always predict, a ball bouncing a wrong way, a ball bouncing up off of a receiver's hands that turns into, a pick, say, unfortunately on 3 first drives. And that's just the way it lands, right, during the season. Then all of a sudden the Ravens get behind in a game and they may have to play it a little bit differently. And then, it can change the whole outcome of the way a game, works out. So, I mean, there are just these random things, that can cause a team to not get to execute completely on the strategy that it wants, which I think they'd still be very happy with a split like that. But I've got them at 1,025 plays, so it's still a really good pace. So that's 492 passes and 533 runs. As far as Lamar Jackson goes, I mean, it's like you said, his accuracy, his pinpoint accuracy, he ranked 5 of 35. So the number of throws that he's making that are literally right where it needs to be for the receiver. What's interesting is, even though he had that, and now this is using Pro Football Focus's quarterback annual, where they chart, all of these throws, his overall accuracy, which includes pinpoint plus throwing within the frame of the receiver, And when they grade these, the way it works, if they see a defender closing and they think the quarterback's throwing it on purpose into a bad spot, right, to avoid, a pickoff, a batted pass, anything like that, they give the quarterback credit for that. They won't count that, against them. But whenever you look at the pinpoint plus the accurate throws to the frame, he was minus 2.7, versus the rest, of the league. So, I mean, he was a little bit below the league average. And really where he seemed to struggle the most was throwing behind his receivers, 10.9%, which is a plus 4.2% throwing, really it's a catchable ball, but the receivers got to turn back to catch it. So they call that a catchable inaccurate pass, where he ranked 32 out of 35. So even though he has that pinpoint, he still seems to be like a little bit, he's either really accurate or, just accurate, enough. Now I think, certainly, he can improve, on those things. But if you look at, how he's done from a standpoint, of throwing the ball down the field, versus, throwing it in shorter, situations. So behind the line of scrimmage, if you're looking at, either frame or above or better, right? The pinpoint, he was minus 1.6 versus the league. 0 to 9, he was minus 4. And 10 to 19 yards, he was minus 4.6. But the offense creates so much room, Matt, for what he does. And then when you look at what he did downfield, which had been kind of an issue a little bit before, he actually was good. I mean, his 20 plus yards, he was 7.6%, above the NFL average. Now, some of these things, they're smaller sample sizes, so it's not like it's necessarily sticky from year to year. I like to look at it as context, just to see, does it look like he can overall, make most of the passes, and when we look at his accuracy and we look at, where he finished up, and everything, I think he's still fine. He's a quarterback, that's growing. And I think he's just got certain things that he's got, to try to figure out. But as far as, thinking about his first reads versus his next reads and those things, I mean, he was really pretty good. I mean, the NFL average first read, Matt, is 67% of passes. He was 68. Next read, the average is 13%. He was 18%. Check downs on average are 3% or 5%. He was only 3, so he doesn't check the ball down. And then the scramble drill, he was 1% above the league average. 6% of the time he threw the ball versus 5%. But the thing is, when he gets outside, of the pocket, and what he can do there as a runner and as a passer, he's just a lot to deal with. I mean, he just puts you in a really tough spot, I mean, because you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. I mean, if you stop the covers to take care of him, he can hit it deep. And you do have to worry about him, right? Or if, you say, okay, we're just going to wait back and then I'll get him when he gets to me. No, then he's going to, like what you said earlier, you can barely catch the guy. He's like Barry Sanders or something. So it's just it's a conundrum big time, for, offenses. But his big time throws from outside the pocket, 7.4% versus the NFL average of 4.7%. That's kind of like Russell Wilson, right? In a way. I mean, I'm not saying he's Russell Wilson, but that's the kind of thing Russell Wilson does. He puts people in a real jam, once he breaks the pocket. So
Before
I think those are.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
Before you get into your projections, which I definitely want to hear, but I want to add to a couple points you made because they're worthwhile in terms of like the data's great with that, and I think it matches what you see on the field when you say he throws behind guys over the middle. And that kind of points out to one of the things I mentioned with Miles Boykin, because while you could add with Miles Boykin that, he didn't get a ton of targets. So what about Mark Andrews, who, who did play particularly well, who plays in the middle of the field, or Marquise Brown or some of these other guys. But the point being is that when you're behind guys in the middle of the field, sometimes that has to do with when the player settles into a zone and whether they do that right. And you had 2 rookies who were playing and often working in the middle of the field. Also, it has to do with whether you know how to adjust and expect the ball at a certain point because of the fact that the plays lasted a little longer than you expected as a route runner, and your quarterback's under pressure, and you think to yourself, my quarterback's a runner. If he hasn't gotten rid of the ball by now, I might as well be looking downfield to block, or I might as well start to turn upfield to address that, as opposed to keep my eye out for the ball, especially because of the fact that he surprises so many people. He surprised, I've had Russ Landis does our scout talk, former NFL scout, and before he and I were doing this, we had a discussion about Lamar Jackson. He was like, "Look, I do an analysis on Jackson on quarterbacks, and his accuracy, the way I chart it, was lower than Jake Locker, which is like among the lowest I've ever seen." He goes, "So I'm really worried that if he doesn't get with the right team that wants to develop him, he could really be in a lot of trouble." He goes, "But to your point about him," because we were debating him, he goes, "To your point about him, I finally watched him, and I watched him in the pocket, and his pocket play is unbelievably good, like so underrated. Nobody, it's like shocking how good his pocket play is." So when NFL scout types are shocked by the players work in the pocket, you have to think that extends to the receivers not expecting it. And one of the things Boykin said was, "I just didn't expect him to throw the ball at some of these points because it looked like he was dead to rights, and somehow the ball just came out in a split second at a point where I was about to turn upfield." So I could see how some of the stats may not, the context behind some of the stats, and it may not be a great full-on correlation, or may not even correlate to a level that's statistically relevant, but anecdotally, you can see evidence that some of this has to do with, for sure, Jackson's accuracy. Some of it has to do with his rapport with his receivers, and that he is so great in the middle of the pocket in a tight area, better than most, that even his receivers who are young just didn't count on that being the case.
Well, to your point, like his grade, from a clean pocket, he was graded 10 out of 35. Under pressure, he was number 1 out of 35 quarterbacks in the league. Turnover worthy plays, number 1 out of 35. So even though he may have had, some accuracy, hiccups along the way, he was still completing a high percentage of his passes. He wasn't turning the ball over. And, oh, by the way, his positive, his big time throws, which, were basically, the throw, this is where you kind of start to separate some of the things that the great quarterbacks can do versus not. He's 7 out of 35. So I mean, it's kind of, honestly, you're kind of nitpicking, the guy because it's working. What I think, there is a caution. Does his, accuracy need to improve? Probably, but to your point, there could be a lot of factors going into that. I think the other component of that is he's still a young player that's going to, be improving. It's not like his accuracy is horrendous, based on, all the data that I'm seeing. I think, there's some good points and some bad points about it. But with his decision-making and everything that he has, and he's so calm and collected, and to your point, it doesn't take big hits when he runs. And there's so many things, to love about Lamar Jackson. It's just, it's hard to let anything really just drag you down too much. As far as, what I've got him projected for, I've got him playing every game. I'm not worried about it. There's some actually pretty good data. I'll have to find it, and I'll have to send it over to you. But someone had recently done I can't remember who did this, and I feel bad because I should be mentioning them on the podcast, but we'll come back to it another time. But quarterbacks that run really aren't any more at risk than quarterbacks that don't.
And this has been an anecdotal film point that I know that guys like Emory Hunt and Brandon Howard, who have talked about for years and years, because when you run, you're in more control and you're taking more active action, and you're not at risk for bad angled hits, and especially if you're a fast, athletic quarterback. If you're Trent Green, well, sure, you're going to slide into an oncoming 250-pound linebacker and get your bell rung and be out for out for years, because you're just
RG3,
not that athlete.
If you're RG3, you just don't know how to slide, and you hurt your knee on a slide.
Yes, but if you're a quarterback who's coordinated and who can actually change direction and see the field, you're like a runner, like a running back. So, but if you're just an immobile pocket quarterback who occasionally ran, or you just stay in there like Carson Palmer, you're going to get your knee imploded. I mean, those things are more likely to happen because of the odd angles. So it's good to see studies like that kind of mirroring what you can see anecdotally and validating that.
I think what will be interesting is as we continue to get more data around the years now where quarterbacks have been so extremely protected, which has been inactive. It's like an endangered species. They keep getting more aggressive, with the quarterback protection rules, all the time. Obviously, player safety overall, period. They're trying to do more with, outside of the whole COVID-19 thing. Anyway, I won't take you down that path, Matt. But as far as
slowly I turn.
But as far as it will be interesting to see, do they actually end up being in a slightly more harm leaving the pocket just because of how protected they are? That's kind of one of the questions remaining because, we're still kind of, I wouldn't say early, but it's, there's definitely some rules that have gone into effect in the last, 6-7 years. So anyway, overall, though, it doesn't seem to be an issue. But for Jackson, I've got him at 7.5 yards an attempt. I've got him at 64% completion rate. So that is 3,690 yards. I've got him at a touchdown rate of 5.5%. So that's 27 passing touchdowns. And again, last year, what he did on the passing touchdowns was amazing. If there's any part of his game that I think, could come back, to earth, and it didn't necessarily just because of him, it's just because of like how well it went last year.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, it's somewhere, and again, it's not, I don't want to come on here and just talk all about regression, but it is real. I mean, and if you look at, the amount of passes he's likely to throw based on the way we think these game scripts are going to go, me looking at that 48-52, I mean, 27 touchdowns is still a lot of touchdown passes for somebody, with 492 attempts. 5.5% is very healthy. Now, if he does it again this year, I could consider him to be more like a Russell Wilson, because Russell Wilson has been over 6% every year of his career except 1 year. And that's insane. That's elite. Most quarterbacks love to have 2 years like that in their whole career, and Russell Wilson does it every single year. So Lamar Jackson, if he continues to progress, maybe I'll think a little differently about that next year. But 5.5% is still really high. It's above. I'm staring at my board right now with everyone that I have projected. He's still the highest person in my view besides Dak Prescott, who I also have at a 5.5%. And I have Mahomes at 6.5. So, I mean, he's still right there. He's one of my top 5 guys as far as touchdowns per attempt. Interceptions, I've got him at 7. Then I've got him with 165 rushing attempts at 5.5 yards per carry for 908 yards. I have him at 6 rushing touchdowns. So if you are a fantasy player, that's 375 points. That still comes out right there. I've got he and Dak Prescott and Mahomes I've got Prescott at 360. I've got Mahomes at 372, and I've got Lamar Jackson at 375. So I've got them all right there together. He does also, have, to your point, weapons that are going to be getting better. So I try to consider that as well when I think about his touchdowns. He's, like you said, playing with a lot of young players. Now you get another year with Boykin. You get Hollywood Brown healthy. You add Duvernay. I mean, there's potential that, his weapons are even better than they were last year.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I have Jackson, Mahomes, and Watson all within the same tier at the very top. Jackson has the most points for me because I do my rankings a little bit differently for football guys. I actually bake in like a number to like lower their fantasy value so that I can just use my projections for my rankings. So I don't remember what my actual total is in terms of that. My adjusted totals are about 70 points lower, I think, so that I can fit those quarterbacks within a range. But yeah, Jackson's my top point scorer in fantasy football if you're just going to look at it overall. So yeah, I'm with you there. Talking about these receivers, I mean, this is the area for growth, for this team is Jackson and the receivers. Yep. Can he throw more outside? Do they want him to even throw more outside with some of those power throws? Probably not. I mean, Deshaun Watson isn't going to change at this point. I doubt that they're going to ask Lamar Jackson to change too much in that area either. I think they're going to continue to try and do what they do and force teams to stop them, and they'll find other ways to win rather than like the power throws, like the curls and the comebacks and the deep outs. But that said, you look at this team, I look at a guy like Willie Snead. I still think he's somewhat of a factor, but not a fantasy factor. I think 23 targets, 16 catches, 169 yards and a few touchdowns because he's a smart red zone player. They scheme him open. He knows what to do. He can make some contested plays occasionally for a smaller, slower guy with some good short area quickness. So, not a big time factor in terms of fantasy, but still a factor on the team, at least early on. Chris Moore, not much of a factor. I'm not even going to talk about his production at this point, even though if someone gets hurt, he could factor in greatly because he's a good deep ball player who can win contested catches and has the trust of Jackson, at least from 2 years ago and some last year. Miles Boykin, how much can he improve? This is where it's like I would say he has theoretical upside, but I don't know if practically that's actually there. So like I still love his talent, but I think he got matched to the wrong team. And I think that he's a second contract somewhere else player who will need an injury with that somewhere else place for him to actually prove he's more than, because he's going to get labeled. He's going to get labeled by the time he gets out of here, and you're not going to see the best of him. But I have him at 33 targets, 23 catches, 350 yards for 15 yards a catch and 4 touchdowns. Again, not fantasy value at all for this guy. But in theory, if they start expanding a little bit more with him, or he improves a little bit more in the middle because they're gonna need to throw to these receivers a little bit more often than the second tight end. Maybe you could see Miles Boykin at best double those numbers. So maybe now you're looking at a 66 catch, a 46 catch season, maybe 700 yards, maybe 6 to 8 scores if he becomes more like the de facto second tight end in terms of what the role was last year, even though it's from a different position. I'm not counting on that. Devin Duvernay is the most interesting player on this board, if you ask me, because Duvernay has the speed to play outside. He's better against press than what I think people characterize him to be. He didn't drop a ball until like a month into his senior year at Texas. So he's like sure-handed. He can win the acrobatic plays, and they used him in the backfield, often in the red zone at Texas, to run the ball. Like they literally had him run, and because he was a good high school running back, and he showed it. Like he showed he could run between the tackles, especially from spread sets. So why wouldn't you spread the field with Devin Duvernay in the backfield to confuse this team? And you can run option. You can hand him the ball, and they're gonna say, yeah, whatever, we're not covering that guy out of the backfield, and then he gashes them for a 10-yard score, and the film, they look at that film, the next few teams that look at the film go, well, we're gonna have to account for this guy because he's had 3 touchdowns in the past month, and now we're gonna have to do more with him. But imagine him running bullet routes out of the backfield with his track speed. Imagine him, running, getting matched up against linebackers and safeties as the running back, or splitting him out into the slot because of, where he was, and he's in the backfield with Mark Ingram or J.K. Dobbins, and doing some of these things they can do imaginatively where he's technically not a running back or a tight end, but he's getting put in spots where he might as well be the tight end detached from the field, from the formation, just like they did with Hayden Hurst, or just like Mark Andrews. The difference is the origination point is different, but where he ends up ultimately lining up before the ball's snapped will be the same place. So you can see how they can window dress some of the same stuff, but just take Duvernay and go, let's make the defense account for him as a running back, then move him to where we put Hurst in the past or Andrews in the past. And now they're screwed because his speed is like a blatant mismatch, and they're going to have to call a timeout, or they're going to have to live with the consequences. And they're going to live with the consequences at times. So Duvernay, to me right now, I'm conservative with them. I have him at 25 targets, 15 catches, 170 yards for 11 yards per catch for 2 touchdowns, and 10 rushes for 47 yards and a touchdown. Not fantasy value numbers, but he's a guy I'm targeting in the last round of drafts. I'm targeting him in the mid rounds of dynasty drafts. it's like I can't seem to get my hands on all the receivers I really want at the top of drafts and dynasty leagues. I wonder why that is, but but Duvernay is a guy that I'm getting in every draft because no matter what I say and how much I like about him, everybody sees him with the Ravens and nobody wants him at the range that he's a bargain. So I'm getting him. So then you get to Marquise Brown, and to me, Marquise Brown is the guy. I'm got him at 98 targets, 59 catches, 797 yards and 7 touchdowns, and about 4 rushes for 61 yards and a touchdown. So I'm expecting, the biggest season from Brown, more touchdown dependent for him to really be in that upper echelon of wide receiver 3, wide receiver 2 for fantasy, but capable of doing that because we're going to see, I think, a better Marquise Brown than last year, at least in terms of physicality, explosion, understanding of the offense, versatility, and I think he's going to be even more wide open than he was last year on certain types of looks, or be more effective. So the hidden upside is really with Miles Boykin and mostly Devin Duvernay. To me, Devin Duvernay, if he can adjust quickly, and the team seems to love him, and he kind of has that attitude. This is more Sigmund Bloom narrative street that I like to make fun of, and I make fun of Bloom with this to his face on shows if you listen to us, and he makes fun of himself as the mayor of narrative street. If you're going to go narrative street, well, the last time I went narrative street, it was Mike Thomas after he got drafted, and it was Cardale Jones telling the media, listen, that dude's going to be calling up Drew Brees. Like, he probably called up Drew Brees 10 minutes ago and told him, get ready for me to be, like, attached to you. Because when I took over the Ohio State job, Michael Thomas attached himself to me and was like, asking every question in the book to make sure we were on the same page, and was like my best friend whether I wanted him to be or not, to make sure that he had rapport with me. And he did the same thing with Breeze. Like when on Twitter, you could literally say, I need your, basically it was essentially, I need your contact information, let's get to work. Like literally 5 minutes after he was drafted. Devin Duvernay, the coaches commented that Duvernay was already asking about the playbook and when he was going to get it. Like, it was like his first question. It was like one of the first things he said when they talked to him on the phone. It wasn't like, I'm so glad, I'm going to buy my mom a house, start crying, all that stuff that players deservedly get to do after such a wonderful event. He's more like, when do I get the playbook so that I can get to work? And they loved his serious approach to the game. And if it's anything like even half as good as Michael Thomas, we might see a guy here who could give us 500 to 800 total yards in this offense as a combined runner and receiver in that Danny Woodhead role that when they had Woodhead after he was with the Chargers for a while.
Yeah, man, I love the talk, on Duvernay, and I get where you're coming from, as well. It's like, talking about this as a real NFL offense, versus, some folks are listening to this, for fantasy. As a real NFL offense, I just love the mixture that this team has created. Duvernay is just another great example, to your point. And like I was talking about earlier, Hayden Hurst moving on, you may see a little bit less of 12 personnel. You're definitely not going to see, 13, personnel, a ton. You could see a little bit less of some of those heavier sets. And to your point, what we could see is Duvernay moving around inside, detached, like you said, from the formation, but getting to attack those those inner areas of the field where he creates huge mismatches, to your point, whether it's a safety coming down to have to take him, or it's a linebacker, or it's a zone coverage where, he's splitting between them. And if he can get on the same page, with Lamar Jackson, I think for dynasty players, there's definitely, to your point, upside, because we know where Lamar Jackson is really good is in the middle of the field. And there's room to have two guys doing that. You could have Andrews and you could have Duvernay doing that. So, right now, I'll go ahead and throw the tight ends with mine.
Good.
In, so you can come back and circle, back to the tight ends. I've got Mark Andrews as the number one, target, on the team. I think the thing to mention, here with Andrews, it's interesting too, is he limped through most of last year, Matt. I mean, he had foot, shoulder, knee, ankle. He was questionable in week 2, 3, 4, 6, 15, the wild card game. He was out week 17. So I mean, he was basically battling through injuries, and he was a player that his routes per drop back. So that's the number of times the player's in a route when the team's actually trying to pass the ball. They were lower than what you would expect, right, from a normal tight end. His snaps, they were trying to protect him as well. Last year his snaps, I mean, he averaged 44% of the snaps per game. If you take out the games he missed, he was right around 50% of snaps. So his routes per drop back was a little bit higher than that. He was at 61%. If you take out the weeks where he was injured, it's also a little bit higher than that. But I think there's a real chance for Andrews this year, now that you don't have Hayden Hurst as the third guy rotating in. Nick Boyle is still going to be out there plenty for 12 personnel, but Hayden Hurst is leaving behind 41% of the routes per dropback. So I think it's easy to think that Mark Andrews, if healthy, he could easily see 70 to 80% routes per dropback, more like what you would see, from a normal, tight end. They clearly want him on the field, when they're in games where they're, competitive. In those games, you'll see his routes per dropback spike. There were a lot of games where they just didn't have to do it, and he was hurt. So I don't think they wanted to force it. And that was part of the deal. So I think a lot of people forget that. And he still did what he did last year, despite all of that. So he still accounted for 22%, of the targets. He averaged 24% per game if you get rid of the games where he had to leave earlier or he missed the game. I have a hard time seeing him going backwards. Yeah, I think the touchdowns, could be a little bit of a problem, but I have him at 123. When I say problem, I mean he scored so many last year. But I have him at 123 targets, 25%, of the target share. I have him at 80 receptions, 1,039 yards, and 8 touchdowns. So that squarely puts him in my top, the top 4 tight ends that I'm willing to take if I'm a fantasy drafter. I've got, Kelsey, Kittle, then you've got Andrews, and you've got Ertz. And I think he deserves to be right there, because if he has a chance to even do more than what I have here. And he's clearly shown to have the rapport, with Lamar Jackson. So that's my number 1 target. Number 2 on the team, I've got Marquise Brown. Brown's another guy. Like you said, he was not well. He was hurt coming in. He battled injuries in camp. He missed part of week 5. He missed part of week 6. He missed part of week 7. He was listed as questionable in week 9. He had foot, hip, ankle. He missed 2 games for illness. The ankle really plagued him from week 9 on.
And they took him out during blowouts.
Yeah, and they took it exactly. They did the same thing. It's like they didn't have to have him or Mark Andrews in a lot of these blowouts, and with them being gimpy, there's a lot that could change. If all of a sudden the game scripts are more competitive and they're both healthy, these guys could explode in roles. Like, I think there's a lot of room. There's meat, on the bone. Now you still have an offense that's going to run the ball more than it's going to throw it, but they're going to run quite a few plays. So, I mean, there will be limitations as far as fantasy owners. You can't expect, they're not going to throw the ball 600 times. So you're not going to get the same number of targets you would expect, like what you may see with the Steelers or some of these other teams, but the efficiency is so strong. And I don't see the efficiency. I see the efficiency coming down to earth some, but I don't see it as being, oh my gosh, all of a sudden Baltimore's completely figured out and nobody knows what to do. I think there are elements to Marquise Brown's game that we just still haven't even seen. And so I'm excited about him. I've got him as the number 2 target with 21% of the targets. That's 103 targets, 67 catches. I've got him at 13.5 yards per catch. And again, I want your thoughts there, because I was a little torn on that number, because I know he can do more than that, but they were using him in certain ways last year based on what I think he could do based on his health at the time.
That's the same figure I have.
Okay. So but I know there's room for that to be a 15. There's room for that to be a 16. So I feel like that's another area there's upside. So I've got him at, 67 catches for 907 yards, and I've got him at 7 touchdowns. And so, I mean, if you're somebody, if you're a fantasy player, I think his ceiling is to be inside the top 24. His floor is the top 48. Right now, his average draft position is wide receiver 30. So he's pretty fairly priced, but I'm very comfortable, taking him there, because I think if he's healthy, he's much more likely to be approaching that wide receiver 24 and sneaking inside, than to be outside of it. You are going to have to deal with some of the blowouts. You're going to have to deal with, do they need them? But, we saw blowouts last year, Matt, when he was healthy, week 1. How many touchdowns did he score against the Dolphins? Now again, he didn't
Right.
even have to play that many snaps that game. That game he was hardly even on the field. He only ran a route on 29%.
Or the
I think he scored
Bengals.
3. Yeah, exactly. Or what he can do to some of these other teams. So anyway, I've got Brown as the second. I do have Boykin as my third, and I have him at 14%. I've got him at 69 targets, 40 catches, 15 and a half yards per catch. But I do have him, to your point, I've got his catch rate at 57.5, where I've got Marquise Brown at a 65% catch rate. And part of it is where Lamar Jackson struggled was outside and beyond the 10-yard, which is what we saw on film last year in preseason. Those were the places he still struggled last year. And those are the areas that Boykin's going to be operating more often. Now, if they, to your point, change his role and move him around a little bit more, I think there's room for more. But I still gave him 14%. I think he's still the third target on the team. And then I actually have Nick Boyle at 10%. And then I've got Devin Duvernay at 9%. And then I have Willie Snead at 5%. I guess I read a lot of the same things you read after the Ravens drafted Duvernay, and I just couldn't help but like getting excited about him. That it may not equal a lot in fantasy, for this year, but I wouldn't be surprised that if it ends up being, a little more than we think. I could see him taking more away from Nick Boyle. I could see him taking more away from Willie Snead. I could see him eating into Miles Boykin. So right now I've got him at 9%. That's 44 targets, 27 catches, 10 and a half yards per catch. That's 280 receiving yards. I'm similar. I don't know how many rushing. I think you had him at a few more rushing attempts, but I did give him, based off of what I was reading, I gave him 3 attempts, for 20 yards, but yeah, they could easily be 10 for, 100 in this offense with the things that they can do. So again, not probably super fantasy relevant this year, but if you're a dynasty player, I'm very similar to you. If I can get my hands on him and I can do it at a discount, I think it's a good move because here's the other thing. What happens if Mark Andrews does get hurt and goes down? Nick Boyle's not all of a sudden going to become a focal point. I think in that
case, unless he's strapped a jetpack to his ass.
Right. He may pick up a few percentage points in target share. But that's where I see, if that were to happen, oh my gosh, what might that do for Duvernay? Because it's in a scheme that's very friendly, to creating space for players because of all the ways they can attack you that defenses have to think about. So I think there's, if something like that happens and you're in a deeper league, in fantasy, and Duvernay's on the waiver wire and Mark Andrews is going down and everybody else is racing to the wire for Nick Boyle, I think everything Matt just shared with you is a good reason you may want to be contrarian to that and say, you know what, I'm going to sneak over here and grab Devin Duvernay for like $2.
Yeah.
Of my free agent budget.
Yeah. Because at worst, what's going to happen is you're gonna get a second chance to grab a tight end, because if Mark Andrews goes down, they are looking for a tight end who's off the street who can catch. Like, they will be scouring or making a trade because they need it. And if you best believe the 2 tight end offense they had last year and what they can do, you can best believe that Bill Belichick basically has Ravens offense tape up all winter long.
He's watching it right now.
Yeah, because they destroyed him on Monday night, and he knows it, and he said it, and he loves what the types of things they do. So you can just look at Daniel Jeremiah's Move the Sticks podcast, and where I think on Twitter he shared some write-ups of notes that he got from Belichick in Cleveland when Belichick talked about what he looks for when he scouts players. And when you read the offensive players, other than the quarterback, and really even like the quarterback to an extent, other than that, pretty much what he's describing is personnel that could play well in a Baltimore offense. So it's, that's fascinating. As far as tight ends go, listen, I like where you're coming from here, and I think I'm going to have to probably tamp down on Jackson's runs a little bit after what we've talked about, and up his passing yardage a bit, and that means giving Mark Andrews a little more love. Like, I didn't factor in all that time that he missed as well as I should have. I have him at 100 targets, 64 catches, so he's got about 23% of the target share of what I've totally given to Jackson right now. 64 catches, 852 yards for 13.3 yards per catch, and 10 touchdowns. I still have him being a big touchdown guy in this offense. Nick Boyle, 44 targets, 31 catches, 321 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Just
We're almost exactly the same.
Yeah, see, there
He'll
you go.
be out there, and people are not going to ignore him because everybody else. So
Yeah.
it's like there will be checkdowns to this guy.
Yeah, I mean, he's the cleanup crew, and it's like the shop's empty, and he can run that broom all up and down the aisle without anybody getting in his way, so he's fine. And Breland, I'm not even, listen, I mean, 18 targets, 8 catches, 72 yards, if he makes the team, okay? Like, he's like UDFA Heath Miller, okay, in terms of like, I don't even want to mention Heath Miller in terms of Jacob Breland. Jacob Breland is a more buff Jason Wood. That's what he looks like, basically. When you look at him with his helmet off. So
Jason Wood catch.
Jason, yeah, I don't know. Jason might be able to catch, so we can call him up and see. I'm sure it's just around the corner from him. Baltimore's not that far if he's already heading over to Philadelphia. So, but yeah, so that's the Ravens passing offense. Let's cover the rushing offense, because obviously that's somewhere between 50 to 57% of the offense at this point. And listen, Mark Ingram, there's 3 ways you can look at this, or 4. J.K. Dobbins gets hurt or falters, and Ingram remains the guy, and he has similar year to last year, which was a career year, because he's an excellent runner, great decision maker, good between the tackles, great pad level, nice movement in terms of shiftiness to be able to make the first man miss, really experienced guy, decent receiver for what you need him to be. Fine. The other option is Ingram starts off the year as the main guy, and J.K. Dobbins ends up being taking over mid-season as the main guy, and Ingram is basically a contributor they flip-flop the role. Or the third option is that Dobbins just overtakes Ingram early. I don't think that's likely to happen, just because he needs to get experience as a pass protector, understand the receiving game a little bit more. So I doubt that that's going to happen. The more likely thing is either Ingram starts off as the main guy and they start to flip-flop, and where Dobbins then turns into mid-guy mid-year, or it's a fairly even split. And the fourth option is that it just remains kind of like Devin Singletary, Frank Gore last year, where Mark Ingram gets basically 2/3 of the meaningful touches, and then Dobbins gets 1/3 of the meaningful touches. So those are the types of combinations you're looking at. Conservatively right now, I would say the thing that's likely to happen with Ingram that I talked about in an article this week was, for Football Guys that's out this week, is Ingram averaged 15 touches per game. He averaged about 0.96 points per touch. So if you're going to use the 0.96 yards per touch as a factor to maintain a steady, which I think in this offense is reasonable enough to maybe do, I think you could reasonably say that Ingram's going to have to give up 5 touches per game to J.K. Dobbins, conservatively, if Dobbins plays reasonably well. So if conservatively, Ingram drops from being like a top 15 back to being like a guy that's your running back 2 or running back 3, unless you expect him to have massive touchdowns and he becomes the touchdown vulture in this offense, which could happen, but I think you're going to see more of a split in the red zone. So I've got Ingram at 200 attempts, 1,000 yards, 8 touchdowns rushing, averaging 5 yards per attempt. 4% of his attempts were going to be touchdowns. I have him at 36 targets for 25 receptions and 200 yards, 8 yards per catch, and a score. That puts him at 211 PPR points, which, when you look at Ingram at that point, I have him, fairly lower than where he was last year, but still, the 23rd ranked back. I just see him fading as the season goes along a bit in terms of his weekly outputs. Dobbins is the guy with the hidden ceiling, whereas, Ingram has the hidden floor. Dobbins I have at 95 attempts for 475 yards, also at 5 yards per attempt and 2 touchdowns. I think I'm underestimating his touchdown potential, because whereas Mark Ingram is a slightly faster version of Jordan Howard, J.K. Dobbins is a guy that outruns secondary players and gets the corner with ease. J.K. Dobbins has some of that LaDainian Tomlinson type of skill to his bag in terms of what he does. He's kind of a mix to me between Ray Rice and LaDainian Tomlinson. If there was a link between the two, he'd be that bridge in terms of ability, and that's a high compliment. So, Dobbins at 2 touchdowns, shoot, that could be 4 or 5, just because defenses get confused on a play and he gets an alley and he's in the secondary before anybody can get an angle on him, and that dude will be gone. I have him at 8 targets for 7 catches, 65 yards, and a touchdown. Not a huge factor in the receiving game right now, only because I'm playing it conservative. This guy could easily, if Mark Ingram gets hurt or Dobbins just plays as well as he did the way he looked to me on tape, J.K. Dobbins could easily have 150 of the carries this year out of the 300 to, or more. And I've also basically overestimated, or was conservative and probably overestimated how much Gus Edwards and Justice Hill might get, because they're talking about Gus Edwards being on the bubble. I have Gus Edwards at 66 attempts for 320 yards and 2 touchdowns, and 14 targets for 8 catches, 72 yards. That could easily end up in Josh Dobbins' lap right there, and now you're looking at 161 carries, 795 yards, 4 touchdowns, 22, targets, 15 catches, 135 yards receiving. Now you're looking at a guy who's got close to 1,000 yards from scrimmage as a rookie. Justice Hill, 29, 120, 1 touchdown, 20 targets, 11 catches, 94 yards. He's going to be looking for another team soon.
Yeah. Here's my thoughts. I think you have to move Dobbins, up. I agree. Here's the scenario I see. I think Mark Ingram's on the last year of his deal. He's a really good player. Does J.K. Dobbins have more upside? Yes. But Ingram's the veteran. He still doesn't have a ton of mileage for a back that's been in the league as long as he is. So maybe that's the bonus of all those years, right, with New Orleans. He never had 300 carry seasons. He had 200 carry seasons, So, we're talking about a guy with 1,500 carries on his body, and basically, 9 years of play. So he's still healthy, and I think he stays the one. But where I differ than you is, man, I gave J.K. Dobbins all of Gus Edwards and more, because I just don't see – and I like Gus Edwards. I just don't – when the team spends the second-round pick on Dobbins, unless he really comes out and falls on his face, I don't see how Gus Edwards has a role. They're not going to carry 4 of those guys active. I think they like Justice Hill as a guy that could do a little something in the passing game, which Dobbins could also help there, right? You've talked about Dobbins as a receiver, but, that's where Hill could add something. And Edwards and Dobbins and Ingram seem to be more duplicative. So to me, you could have Ingram, Dobbins, and Hill, or is it Ingram, Edwards, and Hill? Now, I guess what could happen, Matt, is Dobbins maybe is inactive 2 or 3 games, right? And Edwards starts off the season as the 2. And then Dobbins overtakes Edwards. So in that case, maybe it works out more like you have. But what I did is I actually gave, Edwards has been 22% roughly, of the carry. He was 22% last year. The year before, he was 26%, of the team attempts. I gave Dobbins 27.5%, and I gave Mark Ingram 35%, of the carries on the team. So I've got Ingram at 187 attempts. I've got Dobbins at 147. So I don't have quite at that even split, but more that it's getting more to the, if I were to pick a scenario you talked about, that's the one I see it approaching. And the reason why is I just think, as good as Dobbins can be, Mark Ingram was still really good last year. It's kind of hard to be like, hey, dude, you're going to have to take the bench when you're averaging over 3 yards after contact the last 6 years of your career. You did it again for us. Like you said, you can make people miss at the second level. He doesn't have the gear that Dobbins has, but he's still good enough, and they're going to depend on him in other scenarios because he's the veteran and he knows the game, So, but to your point, I do think that the upside is if Mark Ingram goes down, J.K. Dobbins could win your league.
Yes.
If you're a fantasy player. Now, the Ravens do love to rotate players. Is there a chance that Gus Edwards then turns into the old J.K. Dobbins? J.K. Dobbins becomes the Mark Ingram? Yeah, but with as much upside as UC and JC's and Dobbins, even at that point, I still think Dobbins is a potential league winner. The problem you're going to have in fantasy is, especially if you're in sharp drafts, people are onto it. They're already drafting him. Basically, they go within a few picks of each other.
Yeah, this is like Larry Johnson, Priest Holmes, way back in the day.
Yes, it's exactly like that. And so you can't be buying Dobbins to start. But if you want to pay to get him, I don't blame people. But you need to be thinking about your roster construction. Same thing with Kareem Hunt. People are taking those two guys right there. Don't take either one of those players expecting them to start for you in your first few games. Let it play out. You need to circle back around and do something else with your roster. It's fine to grab them there. Just don't make the mistake some people do. Oh, because I took him in the 6th round, I'm putting him in my starting lineup week 1. No, you're making an investment that you're going to give time to pay off because the upside's so huge. And that's why it cost you a 6th round pick, not because he's going to be in your starting lineup week 1. So just if you're a fantasy player, just think about that. So if you want to take Dobbins, it is going to cost you. And I think there's strategies you can deploy to make it work. And so you can see what's going to happen. And if Mark, like Matt said, if Mark Ingram goes down, it's ball game. But I think that, 150 attempts for Dobbins, 190 attempts for Ingram, right in there. I've got them both at 4.5 yards per carry. I got no issues with 5 in this offense. This is just me doing my,
Sure.
some of my regression stuff. But I've got 7.5 touchdowns for Ingram. I've got 5.3 for Dobbins. I've got them basically split as far as targets, 6% to Ingram, 5% to Dobbins. So that's 22 catches for Ingram, 18 for Dobbins, 177 yards for Ingram, 140 yards for Dobbins. I've got them both with a touchdown and a half in the receiving game. So that puts, to your point around Mark Ingram, it's interesting. I went back today. I actually had a tweet about this. If you go look at the parameters that Mark Ingram operated within as far as his carries and, his targets last year, he scored 5 receiving touchdowns, Matt, last year on 26 catches. That's not feasible. That's not going to happen again. No. So you got to kind of take him down a little bit from there. Ingram is a guy that's shown over the years on less touches and a good offense. He can still put up really good numbers, but he was also getting targeted a lot more by the Saints, in the last 3 or 4 years before, Kamara got there. So the way I look at it is what you said. Dobbins is still a good investment. I think the upside is huge. I think he's going to eat into what Mark Ingram does, and he's going to bring Ingram's floor down a little bit. I think Ingram's still good enough to hold him off. But if the injury happens, you're going to be elated. And if that's now all of a sudden one of your flex players, oh my gosh, you're in a great spot.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to end this conversation, on Baltimore, it was a great one. I look at Mark Ingram. If Ingram is a smart player, no, I'll put it this way: if he's a wise player, and it's hard to be wise in your early 20s to late 20s, early 30s, it's still, there's still a lot to learn in life, and they haven't been exposed to a lot of business outside of the business of football, and even then, they're hyper competitive guys. So when they're told that their time is over to being a starter, that's hard to hear. Or especially when they still feel good and they've put up good production. But if I'm Mark Ingram, I'd be looking around and going, this is my last year with this contract. J.K. Dobbins is really darn good, but I'd like to win a ring. Do I really want to go somewhere else where I'm the starter for part of the year until the rookie gets into gets good enough to overtake me, and it's not a very good team? Or do I want to stick with this team and be like the situational contributor and take a pay cut basically, but have get a decent deal and be a part of a Super Bowl winning team. I would stay here. And I think the Ravens probably, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Mark Ingram resigns, but ends up having another 2 to 3 years in probably two, but 2 years in Baltimore where he can just kind of be like the backup, the closeout guy, the guy who can start when needed for injury, but doesn't have to be the man down in and down out. And I hope he gets to do that. He decides to do that when his contract is up in Baltimore. So you can follow Dwain's work at PFF. You can follow him at Dwain McFarland on Twitter. He's awesome. And of course, you can find me at Matt Waldman. And I got a lot of stuff coming out that my RSP readers have gotten a first look at in terms of the rookie wide receiver class. And videos that you're going to enjoy on YouTube. So you can check out my RSP channel, Matt Waldman's RSP Film Room. Subscribe to that. I think you'll find wonderful content on there that'll help you learn about the game and get an edge also in fantasy. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great week.